Okay, we are doing a series at the moment on our vision and more specifically our mission blocks, which are kind of the key things that we adopt or want to do in order to achieve our vision. And the one we're looking at today is the last one. We've got next 2 weeks we're going to be looking at it, and it's quite a low key one. It's called Transforming the World. And so I just want to read it to you. It's from our website, which is a great place to visit, I'd just like to say, our website. And I'll just read it from you, Transforming the World. And this is what we have there. And just to reflect, anything like this to a measure is aspirational. You know, we are on a journey in this. But we believe that church is God's plan to restore a broken world. We're part of a national and global gospel story, called to bring hope to the nations, be generous with our resources, intercede unceasingly, and radically impact the world around us. We want to see the lost saved, the sick healed, and the captives set free. We believe we are a sent people, called to go into the world to proclaim the gospel, to reach every nation with the good news of God's ever-increasing kingdom. I just realized, actually, there's a couple of people here who are here for the first time. My name is Keath. And along with my wife, Michelle, we have been leading the eldership team here at KingsGate since 2011. And we've been part of the church since 1995, since it was planted. They can't get rid of us. We've been around as long as the ark. So just wanted to introduce myself. I am conscious. Sometimes we get up here and we assume everyone knows who we are. I'm not some strange dude who plays guitar and they just gave the mic to so that you know. Yeah. And for my... God's way to keep me humble is get me working with Paul Harper for large portions of my life. And I just want to say an absolute blessing. He is an absolute blessing to me. He doesn't like it when I get all soppy. When I think of transforming the world, and when I look at this mission block that we have, it's kind of broken for me into two parts, both equally important. The first one is transforming the culture in which we live. What does it look like to transform the way we do business? What business looks like? What does it look like to transform with the kingdom of God education? What does it look like to transform the way that we treat women and girls and deal with violence against women and girls? What does it look like to bring a kingdom reality and transform that? That is a cultural change. What does it look like for artists, for people who write books and write poetry, write songs, do movies, paint pictures? What does it look like for you to take the gift that God has given you and be transforming with that? And what I'm talking about here is these things transcend national boundaries, transcend countries. And, when I look at this, and I get inspired by examples like, obviously, someone like William Wilberforce, who through his faith, along with others, was instrumental in removing slavery. What is he? He transformed the way the world did things. We forget that slavery, it was so ingrained in the way culture lived. It would have been impossible for people to imagine what a world without slavery. And yet he did, and he spoke about it. Another example of this, of people who transform their world, is who's heard of Harriet Beecher Stowe? Anyone here? Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book in about 1850 called Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was a Christian. She was a person who was involved in the abolitionist movement in America. And her book lit the fire wasn't the only thing, but was hugely significant in changing public opinion about what slavery was all about, bringing it to the consciousness. It's amazing what you can do if you write a book, write a song, paint a painting inspired by the kingdom. What does that look like? That sounds very exciting, and I'm leaving it to Paul Harper to talk about next week. We are agents of change. That's what I'm saying, wherever God places us, and Paul's going to pick up on this next week. But another aspect of transforming the world is geographical. And what I mean by that is about going to other nations. Going to other nations, preaching the gospel, planting churches. And that's what the focus is of what I'm going to be speaking about today. And obviously there's an overlap in the two, and there should be an overlap in the two. But I want to just first of all look at some biblical support for this. So I'm going to go through a few passages of scripture quite quickly. And then I'm going to do a little more talking about what we're doing at the moment. But throughout the Bible, there is this call for God's people to take the glory of God's kingdom to the world around us, to the nations. It starts off in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, where in the very first calling of when God creates Adam and Eve, he says, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. The reality is not the whole of God's creation was Eden. There was a place called Eden, but Adam and Eve were to take the glory of what was present in Eden and take it to the rest of creation, to go out, to leave what was comfortable and to take what was there to the world around them. In Genesis chapter 12, which is a key passage in the biblical story, the promise that God gives to Abraham, he becomes Abraham, but at that stage it was Abraham. He tells him to leave everything he knows and to go to a place that God is going to call him. And he says this to him, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So Abraham went. It wasn't so, in this you are going to have the most fandabadozy family and hang out and everything you want's going to be great. And, everyone's going to look and say, wow, you're lucky. We wish we're you. No, we want the blessing that we have placed in, the blessing I've placed in you, Abraham. I want you to take to the world around you because the very seed I have in you is to be transformative of all creation. In Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 14, the prophet says, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. It's not meant to just be in the nation of Israel. It's supposed to be going out beyond those boundaries. In Matthew chapter 28, verse 19, it says, therefore go and make disciples of all nations. That commission which he gives to the disciples, he gives to us as the church. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, the glorious story of the beginning of the Bible, we've been preaching through the book of Acts a bit this year. Jesus says to the disciples, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. A picture of right here, the next place, and then to every other place. You will take this gospel, and I will pour out my spirit upon you, and so that you will have power to proclaim the gospel. There is a power that God gives to us as we go out with his kingdom, to preach and declare his kingdom. Then we go to Romans chapter 10, verse 14 to 18. How then, this is Paul writing to the Romans, how then will they call on him whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah said, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. This picture in this particular passage of the importance and the significance of people hearing the good news of Jesus. And we don't just think about this, guys. It's not kind of like, we don't go to the world with the good name of Jesus like some kind of telemarketing company, like Amway. Come and buy our product. It's because he is life. He is life. He is the basis on which we are reconciled to God, by which we can come near to him, and which we have life in abundance. In Revelation chapter 7, verse 9, there's that gorgeous passage which I'm sure many of you would know. We hear this cry, after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne, before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. To the nations. I think the other day, I forgot when it was, but maybe even the other day, a couple of months ago, I got us all to praise God in our own languages. We went round and we had Portuguese, and we had French, and we had German, and we had Tamil, not from Jeevan though, but we had a whole raft of languages coming forward. And it was just to demonstrate the reach of the gospel and what is represented even here in this room of where the gospel has gone. And this call for us to go into the nations, it's not like a crusade. I hate that word. It's not like crusaders going in to dominate indigenous people, destroy their culture, and convert them at the tip of the sword. Believe in Jesus or die. It's not about even those phrases. Let's take this nation for Jesus. I feel uncomfortable with phrases and terms like that. No, we go into the nations imitating our Savior, who became nothing so that we could know heaven, who laid his life down and in love lifted others up. That is the posture in which we go into the nations around us. And one of the best examples I've seen of this in recent times, there are many, but one which is quite profiled is Heidi and Roland Baker. I don't know if any of you know Heidi and Roland Baker. They lead a ministry in Mozambique. They were at one stage in Indonesia. They felt God moving them on. And they said, which is the poorest country in the world? Okay, we're going there. And where they go to that poorest country in the world, where did they go? They went to the rubbish dumps. And they spoke and they loved and they gave their lives to the kids feeding on the rubbish dumps. And they've invested into that space. They've gone to the marginalized and the broken and went lower than them to lift them up. That's what we're talking about, going into the nations. And if we ignore this call to go, if we blind ourselves to the importance of a global gospel and of going to the nations, what will happen is we shrink. Our world becomes smaller. And as we shrink and as we become more into this depressing place of a depressing existence dominated by what we need, we start to get preoccupied about, how the chairs look and who's doing the coffee this morning and someone upset me around the water fountain. We become concerned about peripheral nonsense and we shrink because we've lost the fact that we're part of a bigger picture. We cannot live under the mantra of something like this. Charity starts at home. Look after your family first, or your church first, or your community first. That we can't live under that space. If we understand the global gospel and we commit to going, what actually happens is we make our family, our church, and our community stronger. Now, obviously, there are caveats within that and wisdom in that space. But actually, when we tell our children that they're part of something bigger, when we tell our church that we're part of something bigger and it's worth to sacrifice for, when we tell our community that that is the case, we actually become stronger. Life begins to flow into this place. And the town, Kingston and London, all around us, feels the blessing of what we are doing in that. There's a spiritual dimension to this. As we give to those, particularly those who cannot give us anything back, that is spiritual currency for us. You cannot outgive God. And if you are giving, and not just financially, but giving time, prayer, emotion, and going, if you are giving to the things that really matter to God, He provides for us in ways that we cannot even begin to imagine. And having been a Christian for many years, been a pastor for many years, there is a tendency for church to bend inwards, to focus in on our own world. And when church begins to bend inwards, it's a cancer for a church. It's a slow death that begins to happen. And even as we enter into a time of great uncertainty, even chaos, instability, rising prices, one of the things I need to do, Keath, the pastor, one of the things we need to do is avoid turning in on ourselves to save ourselves and to focus on our little world. The gospel went out in the midst of chaos. The gospel went out in the midst of war, of insecurity, and they went. And people have been doing it for years. Not only does God call us to the nations, not only do the nations need us, but we need to go for our own good. In November, I'm going to Sri Lanka. I mentioned to you. And I've been going to Sri Lanka for about 8-9 years. Unfortunately, not over COVID, I haven't. And I've been working with a man there called David Ganasarangam. Jeevan's been a few times with me. It's been an absolute blessing. I'm sorry you couldn't be here this time, Jeevan. I'm going there. And Jeevan, if you've been on the news, you would know Sri Lanka's been financially in chaos. They're running at 70% inflation at the moment. Can't get some of the basics. And Jeevan And David has paid for me. He said, we want to pay for you to come. And the reason he wants to do that, so I went to speak to a mutual friend of mine, Rob Hudson, and I said, Rob, listen, I'm feeling bad. This guy, Sri Lanka's in all this kind of financial trouble. How can I get these guys to help pay for my air ticket to come to Sri Lanka? And Rob says, Keath, don't fear, because David has got such a revelation of the spiritual revelation of how you deal with money. He knows that as he sows, he won't lose. He is also so convinced in the power of having people from other churches, and they see me as in some sense, as an Ephesians 4 teaching gift there, and they want me to come in, and he wants that for the church. He wants to build into the nations. Here's a guy who's got nothing in many respects, but with such a revelation of the fact that there is a global gospel. You know, that he is actually, so I said to Rob, Rob, what do you is this a case of Keath? David is sowing to other churches in Zimbabwe. Here's a guy who's sowing with nothing into other nations because he has a revelation of the gospel that he's part of. He's got a revelation of the story that he has. So what are we doing? You guys with me still? You have to say that, otherwise it's awkward for you and for me, and we also, I don't know why I say that. But anyway, what are some of the ways in which we are expressing this desire to go to the nations around us? Well, there are two main areas, or two main ways in which we're doing this. The one is with a group called the Genesis Collective. And the Genesis Collective is a group of churches working together to plant churches around the world, equip people for planting churches, and to help and support church plants around the world. And this was started by Chris and Meryl Venan. Some of you might know should know Chris and Meryl. They've been here a number of times. They led the church out of which this church was planted. Been a father and mother to this church for years. And Michelle and myself have the privilege of being on that leadership team as well. And in September, Michelle, myself, and Sarah Clay, we went to LA and we ministered there in the conference. And one of the things that I noticed when I was there, just by the by, was that there was an authority on what we brought. Now, for those of you, if you're here for the first time, you don't know me, I understand, but for those of you who have been around for a while, you know or know me, this is not my inclination. I don't think we boast about the church in the sense of trying to push ourselves in any way. And in some senses, if I'm honest with you, I doubt myself. But we went to Malibu, where we were ministering, and there was such an authority on what we were speaking about and on what we did. And when Sarah spoke, there was an authority on her. And it just struck me, so many of the churches coming and said, we want to see what you guys are doing. We want to come over to where you are. And it reminded me that there's a call on this church. And I have got to step into that. And we have got to step into that. God, this church is crazy. We're not a massive church, but we've always, over our years, seemed to punch above our weight. And there is a calling upon us. And there's a call, I believe, God is saying, will you step in to what God has for you, what I have for you? And when I was in the States, I recognized that. I saw, my goodness, there is something God is doing in and through us, and we mustn't neglect this. The other thing is, what I noticed, so we are going to be getting some interns coming over next year, and I sent out an email in that regard. But there's a desire for people to come over. The people want to come to KingsGate, see what's taking place here, and spend time with us. That's an amazing encouragement, and should be an amazing encouragement for us. Just to also say, I've mentioned to you that I'm going to Sri Lanka in November. In January, these are some of the things that are taking place over the next little while. In January, from the 16th to the 23rd, this is interesting, there's a motorbike apostolic trip to Sri Lanka. Led by Rob Mad Dog Hutton, not really, well, sometimes he is, and it's basically on motorbikes, and they go into the rural areas to preach the gospel, to help pastors, and to build into churches. And if you are interested in any of these things I'm mentioning today, please come and chat to me so I can give you the details. But you have to give me the details pretty soon if you want to come and do this motorbike trip through Sri Lanka, pastoring and helping and preaching. And then in January, the Genesis Collective is running a church planting course, which is going to be over a year. So if you are interested, or you thought to yourself, actually, I hadn't thought about church planting, but maybe God is stirring something in you for that, they're going to be doing a course from January through to the end of December in this regard. Again, it's online. And if you want to come and speak to me about that, that would be great. And then in May, there's a Genesis event taking place in Wales. It's a combination of a teaching time, ministry time, relationship time, fun time. And last year, the Calders went, Michelle and myself, Paul and Robin and Sarah Clay, and the Lucys went. And that was it, I think. And it would be wonderful to have more of us in that space. It was a really encouraging place, good to meet other churches, vision lifted up. And so if you are interested in that, that's going to be in around about May, and I will give you the details on that. There are other things regarding Genesis, but that is all that I'm going to put up for now. So there's the Sri Lanka trip in January on motorbikes. There is the church planting course starting in January, and there is the event in May. But there's another group as well that we are working with, and you've met Jason and Ali Shields. They're from Ireland. They're based in a place called Cookstown in mid-Ulster, and we have been working with them for 15-odd years. They originally had been part of a church plant in India, and then they planted in Dublin, and now they've planted in mid-Ulster. And they're doing amazing work in a very difficult space. And along their journey, they have gathered around them a number of churches who see them as a gift to those churches. And we've been working and trying to help where we can, be a blessing to them and support them in their work in Ireland. That's another way in which we're trying to express this idea of going to the nations with this incredible gospel. But in light of that, there are two things just to mention and put on your diary if you're interested. There's a church in Armagh, which is called Vibe Church, which is a very vibey church led by two very vibey people, Daryl and Nikki Bain. And one of the things they do, they are going to be leading a team to Latvia in August. Where's it? Start of July. In the start of July, they're going to be leading a team to Latvia, which is effectively working with youth. If you are interested in going along to that, please speak to Paul, and Paul will give you the details. And then in August, there are a number of outreach initiatives that the Vibe Church are doing in Armagh. And if you're keen to be part of that, again, please speak to Paul in that regard. Something just to note about this. Although I've been speaking a lot about Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is a special place in my heart, my eyes, and I think our eyes as an eldership team, are particularly turned to the continent of Europe. We would love to see planting of churches in Europe and the support of churches in Europe. And both the Genesis Collective, which is getting an increasing foothold there, and Jason and Ali have worked into Europe as well. And so that is, among other things, part of the reasons why we are engaging with them. Also, just to let you know that we sow as a church financially to Genesis, we sow financially to Jason and Ali, and we sow financially to the church in Sri Lanka as well to support all the churches that are working with that. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what we are doing with this vision of transforming the world, particularly going to the nations. And just a little thing before I move on to this is my last section. When I go to Sri Lanka this next month in November, when I go there, I'm going to preach. I'm going to do some teaching around specific gifts. I'm going to speak on a Sunday, etc., etc. But what I'm also going to do is I'm going to sit down with David, and I'm going to have a cup of tea with him, and I'm going to hang with him for 2 days just to be with him. And that is as significant a part of anything else I'm doing on that trip. Those small relational moments of support and care are huge. All right. So what part can you guys play in this story? Because every single one of us can be part of this. The first thing is we can pray. Pray for the nations and those who are working in them. And we're going to do a little bit of that before we finish today. That's like usually just a little tagline at the bottom. I'm so challenged by what David does in Sri Lanka. They pray for you. They pray for you. They ask God for prophetic words for you guys. David will phone me and say, hey, Keith, we were praying for you, and one of the orphans had this picture for KingsGate. Can I give it to you? There are people praying for you from other nations because of the work that we do in those nations. Our own prayer should reflect the fact that we are part of a bigger story as well. The other thing to mention is hosting. We are hoping, and what we have already, but we are hoping to get more and more people coming from abroad to come into KingsGate Church. And one of the things that we were really good at many years ago, because it was happening a lot more, is hosting people. And I want to encourage this within the life of the church, that we would begin to open our houses to host people. You do not have to have, your home does not have to be the Hilton Hotel to feel adequate to host people. You need love. You need to be someone who, hospitable, which actually is one of the, if you read through the book of Hebrews, it's actually one of the big things that he says, be hospitable to people, to guests. It was such a major part of the early Christian life. And there was a story, talking about not having facilities to host. I remember hearing the story. A friend of mine was ministering. It was in the Ukraine many, many years ago. And he got there. He was being hosted by an older pastor and his wife. And they got showed into the bedroom. And they, it was humble, but they had a place to stay. And they slept okay that night, etc. And they got up in the morning. They walked out and they realized this old couple had slept on the floor to host them in their house. Would we sleep on the floor? Would we sleep on the couch to host somebody else? Would we get up a little bit early? Would we be inconvenienced for a week to host someone else because of the gospel, because of a bigger story? Pray, host, sow. By sowing to this church, you are enabling this church to be a blessing to church planters and struggling churches all around the world. And you're enabling the gospel to go out. We couldn't do the things that we are doing into the nations without the financial capacity of this church. But we need to have a revelation of the value and the validity and the value of that. The third thing is go. I'm not telling you to go right now. But make use of the opportunities that we're putting out there to go on training, to go to the nations, and to join us on ministry trips. This sounds like a stupid thing, guys. We've got another community in Cobham called KingsGate Cobham. When I go and preach there, or when Paul goes and preaches there, come with us along to that. There is something about getting out of your familiarity, going to another community, and just being there, praying, getting to know people, getting into the motion of actually going somewhere else. But I want to encourage us to begin to take opportunities for this. There is something about going to the nations that changes the way you view things. It changes the way you view lives. I went into a church in Sri Lanka, which was a slum. The size of the venue was about as wide as from one end of that table to the other end of the table to about here. That's how big the venue was. And there were 40-odd people in the venue worshiping, eyes closed, amazed at what God was doing. And I thought to myself, my goodness, you can't help but be shocked by the contrast. And there was a little Casio piano being played with bad audio, like, and they were singing in Tamil, and I don't know what was going on, but I had my hands raised like this at the front. But there is something about being in that space which actually you come back and you suddenly look at your own issues, your own, inconveniences, or whatever. I can't believe they don't have oregano in the co-op this morning. I went there to, I didn't, I was looking for saffron, and they just didn't have it at the corner shop. Like, these are not big issues. They didn't have full cream milk or soya milk or almond milk or whatever other milk it is. Can't believe, no, these are not big issues when you go into another place and you see that. Build connection with these churches. And just to talk a little bit about faithing for finances. Because you can think to yourself, my goodness, how do we do the finances with this? Chris and Meryl's church it's about 120 to 150 adults in the church, and they're about the age between 19 and a half and 20 and a half. They are all baristas. They're all doing kind of menial jobs in order to try and make things work and try and things happen. These kids have gone to South Africa on mission. They have gone to Portugal on another thing that was taking place last year. And what they've done is not that they've just saved to make it happen. They have put their faith out. And what God has done is, as they've put their faith out, God has opened the door and delivered for them. God showed, now all of those kids have a bigger idea of what God can do than many other people because they put their faith out. Just to tell you another little story, just regarding that whole faith venture. Chris Wienand was saying this is not about going to the missions, but it's about having faith for finances. Their family were going to have a reunion. They haven't been together for ages, and his one daughter plants a church. His daughter and son-in-law had planted a church in Australia. Finances are not good for them. And he said, we want to get together as a family for a big event. And they said, listen, we can't come. We can't make it. And Chris's daughter said, listen, I'm not coming unless the whole family can make it, so we're not doing it. So Chris Wienand speaks to his son-in-law Mark and says, Mark, come on, pull yourself together, have a faith venture for this event so we can have the family in one place. And so he kind of coaxes, and Mark is, all right, begrudgingly coming on to this faith venture. So Chris goes and he's speaking at a church in the States, and he just makes some passing comment. He says, we as a family want to get together for a reunion. Hopefully my family in Australia can make it. Something as nondescript as that. A lady comes up to him afterwards and says, I hear you, what's this thing about your family in Australia? Do they need flights? Here's a check for $10,000. Will that do it and cover it? $10,000. Suddenly, Mark is having a revelation of God's provision, and he is stronger in that space than when he was. So part of the journey for us as we go to the nations is believing for God to provide for us. And then lastly, we can go, we can plant. Not everyone will plant, but here's a question. Have any of you ever thought about planting a church? Have any of you ever thought that maybe God is putting it on your hearts? You may go with the call to establish a church. You may go to support a church plant for a little while. I'm just going to go there for a year and be there and support. Your business or the work you do may open a door for a church plant to go into a nation which wouldn't be welcoming to the gospel. A door opens and you go in there and you plant because you create a space for people to come after you. Have you thought about that? There's a guy many of you guys who were at the leadership time last week would remember the video of Jack Naidu. Jack came over here. Jack was in Dubai. He heard Chris preaching about saying, all you need to do is have a dining room table. Have a dining room table, plant, go to a nation and invite people around your table. Tell them how much they love by Jesus. He said, I can do that. He's a businessman, works for Cisco Systems. So he says, I can do that. So he says, well, I'm going to leave Dubai and I'm going to get a transfer to Amsterdam. He's now planted a church in Amsterdam where he sits there and invites people everywhere he meets to come and have lunch and dinner around his table. A person who never thought he was a church planter, a businessman, and yet God is beginning to use him in Amsterdam. The call to go to the nations is not something that just Keith's called to or Paul's called to or a couple of really hardcore kind of people, not that Paul and I are hardcore, but there's a few kind of guys get quite fanatical about Jesus and they want to go to the nations. That's for them, but everyone else doesn't. No, we're all in this call. And you all have a part to play in this. And this is something for us as a church that we want to see grow and grow and grow and grow. So when there's a moment when Keith and Paul might be out, or Keith and Paul might be out in another nation, you know why. If there's reason why we're sowing money into another nation, you know why it's important. And you know why we've got a whole lot of people we're hosting, you know why it's important. Because there's a much bigger story than us. Thank the Lord for that.